Emma Thompson stood before her cracked bathroom mirror, methodically destroying her natural beauty with calculated precision. At 26, she possessed the kind of ethereal loveliness that made strangers pause on the street. Porcelain skin that seemed to glow from within, striking emerald eyes that sparkled with intelligence, and silky auburn hair that cascaded in gentle waves past her shoulders. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, she needed to be forgettable, unremarkable, even repulsive if necessary. Her trembling fingers applied thick, cakey foundation 3 shades too dark, creating an unnatural mask that transformed her luminous complexion into something sallow and lifeless. The rent notice on her kitchen table served as a cruel reminder of why she was doing this. 3 months behind on payments, with her elderly landlord threatening eviction by week's end. Her mother's cancer treatments had drained every penny from her savings, and her part-time job at the local bookstore barely covered groceries, let alone the mounting medical bills. When her best friend Sarah had mentioned a wealthy man looking for a dinner companion, someone genuine, not interested in his money, Emma had seen a glimmer of hope. But she knew exactly what happened to poor, beautiful girls who caught the attention of rich men. They became temporary entertainment, discarded playthings, cautionary tales whispered among other struggling women. So she had devised this plan, as desperate as it was brilliant. She would make herself so thoroughly unappealing that no wealthy man could possibly see her as anything more than a pleasant dinner conversation. She would be safe from exploitation, protected by her own ugliness, while still earning the generous meal payment Sarah had promised would come with the arrangement. Emma darkened her eyebrows into harsh, unflattering lines, smudged dark circles under her eyes to suggest exhaustion and poor health, and pulled her beautiful hair back into the most severe, unflattering style she could manage. Looking at her reflection, she barely recognized the woman staring back, which was exactly the point. The final touches to Emma's disguise were perhaps the cruelest to implement. She had purchased oversized, horn-rimmed glasses from a thrift store, their thick lenses distorting her eyes and hiding their natural sparkle behind a barrier of cheap plastic. Her outfit was a masterpiece of unflattering fashion, a shapeless brown cardigan that hung like a potato sack, hiding every curve and line of her naturally graceful figure. Beneath it, she wore a faded floral dress that had seen better decades, its drab pattern and loose fit making her appear frumpy and much older than her years. The psychological transformation was perhaps more challenging than the physical one. Emma had spent her entire life being told she was beautiful, had grown accustomed to the way people's faces lit up when they saw her, the way conversations flowed more easily, doors opened more readily. Tonight, she would experience the world as it treated women who weren't blessed with conventional beauty. The thought both terrified and intrigued her. How different would people's reactions be? How much of her life's ease had been built on something as arbitrary as genetic lottery? As she practiced walking with a slight hunch, affecting a nervous fidget with her hands, Emma felt a strange liberation creeping in alongside her anxiety. For the first time in years, she wouldn't have to worry about unwanted attention, wouldn't have to navigate the complex social dynamics that came with her appearance. She could just be herself, her wit, her intelligence, her genuine personality, without the complication of beauty either helping or hindering her interactions. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had to become ugly to feel truly seen. Sarah had arranged the meeting at Celestine, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, a place where Emma's usual paycheck wouldn't cover a single appetizer. The man she was meeting was described only as successful, kind, and looking for genuine connection. Sarah had been mysteriously vague about other details, claiming confidentiality agreements and the man's desire for privacy. As Emma took one final look at her transformed reflection, She wondered what kind of person chose to meet potential companions this way, and whether her disguise would be enough to protect her from whatever intentions he might harbor. Celestine Restaurant existed in a realm of understated elegance that made Emma's borrowed shoes feel like lead weights against the polished marble floors. Crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light over tables draped in pristine white linens, where the city's elite conducted business deals and romantic intrigues with equal sophistication. The maître d' had looked at Emma with barely concealed disdain when she'd mentioned her reservation, his eyes sweeping over her frumpy appearance with the kind of judgment she'd never experienced before. It was a harsh introduction to how the world treated women who didn't meet certain aesthetic standards. Alexander Hayes sat at table 12, and Emma's breath caught in her throat despite all her mental preparation. He was devastatingly handsome in the way that seemed almost unfair, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that caught the light, intelligent grey eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and the kind of confident bearing that spoke of success and power. His tailored charcoal suit probably cost more than Emma made in 6 months, and the watch on his wrist could have paid her rent for a year. This was exactly the kind of man she'd needed to protect herself from, exactly the reason her disguise was so crucial. What surprised her was the genuine warmth in his smile as she approached the table. There was no flicker of disappointment, no subtle recoil at her appearance, no polite mask slipping into place. Instead, Alexander stood with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in any situation and extended his hand in greeting. "You must be Emma," he said, his voice carrying the kind of cultured confidence that came from boardroom presentations and million-dollar negotiations. "I'm Alex. I'm so glad you could make it tonight." As he pulled out her chair with old-fashioned courtesy, Emma found herself studying his face for signs of the disgust or pity she'd expected. Instead, she saw only genuine interest and what appeared to be relief. Perhaps he'd been as nervous about this arrangement as she was, though for entirely different reasons. As she settled into her seat, careful to maintain her awkward posture and nervous mannerisms, Emma realized that her disguise might have been more successful than she'd dared hope. For the first time all evening, she allowed herself to believe that this plan might actually work. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Emma had anticipated. She had expected polite small talk, the kind of superficial exchanges that filled awkward social obligations. Instead, Alexander seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, her opinions, her perspective on everything from current events to philosophy. When she mentioned working at a bookstore, his eyes lit up with authentic enthusiasm rather than the condescending sympathy she'd braced herself for. "What's the most interesting book that's come through recently?" he asked, leaning forward slightly, as if her answer genuinely mattered to him. Emma found herself forgetting to maintain her nervous fidgeting as she described a rare first-edition poetry collection that had been donated to the store. Alexander listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was actually processing her words rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. What struck Emma most profoundly was how he treated the restaurant staff. When their server approached, Alexander made eye contact, used his name, and asked about his evening with the kind of personal interest that spoke to genuine character. He thanked the busboy who refilled their water glasses, complimented the sommelier's wine selection, and generally conducted himself with a grace that had nothing to do with his obvious wealth and everything to do with his inherent decency. "You know," Alexander said during a lull in their conversation, "I have to admit something. I was incredibly nervous about tonight." Emma looked at him with surprise, unable to imagine this confident, successful man being nervous about anything. "I haven't done this in a long time. Meeting someone new, trying to make a genuine connection. It's refreshing to talk with someone who seems so real, so unguarded." The irony of his words hit Emma like a physical blow. given that she was quite literally the opposite of unguarded, hidden behind layers of carefully constructed deception. As the evening progressed, Emma found herself facing an unexpected dilemma. She had come here to earn money for rent, to endure a few hours of polite conversation with a wealthy man who would ultimately dismiss her as beneath his notice. Instead, she was discovering someone who seemed to value her mind, her humor, her genuine self, or at least the parts of her genuine self she was allowing him to see. The guilt of her deception was beginning to overshadow the relief of her disguise's success. 2 hours into their dinner, Emma realized she was in serious trouble. Not the kind of trouble she'd anticipated, unwanted advances from a wealthy predator, but something far more dangerous. She was falling for Alexander Hayes. Despite every wall she'd built, every precaution she'd taken, every ugly detail of her disguise, she found herself drawn to his intelligence, his kindness, and the way he seemed to see something valuable in the person she was presenting to the world. Their conversation had evolved from polite dinner chat to the kind of deep, meaningful exchange that usually took months to develop. Alexander spoke passionately about his work in renewable energy, describing projects that could change the world, while acknowledging the frustrating realities of corporate politics and investor relations. Emma found herself sharing stories about her mother's illness, her struggles with debt, her dreams of maybe someday writing a novel, truths she hadn't planned to reveal, but that seemed to flow naturally in response to his genuine interest. "You have such an interesting perspective on things," Alexander said, his grey eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her heart race. "Most people I meet in my world are so focused on appearances, on saying the right thing to the right person. You speak like someone who's actually lived life, who's faced real challenges and come through them with your integrity intact." Each word felt like a small betrayal of her own deception, a reminder that everything he was praising about her authenticity was built on a foundation of lies. The restaurant around them had gradually emptied as the evening wore on, other diners finishing their meals and departing for whatever entertainment awaited them in the city's nightlife. Emma and Alexander remained at their table, neither seeming eager to end their conversation. When Alexander suggested they order dessert, Emma agreed despite knowing that every additional minute in his company was making her situation more complicated. She was supposed to be protecting herself from exactly this kind of connection, exactly this kind of emotional vulnerability. "I have to ask," Alexander said as their dessert arrived, "and please forgive me if this is too personal, but you seem different from other women I've met through arrangements like this." Emma's blood turned to ice, wondering if he'd somehow seen through her disguise, if her deception was more transparent than she'd believed. "There's a sadness in your eyes, like you're carrying something heavy. I hope I'm not overstepping, but if there's anything I can do to help." Emma felt tears threatening behind her thick glasses as Alexander's genuine concern washed over her. Here was a man who, despite her best efforts to make herself unappealing, was offering help, showing kindness, demonstrating the exact opposite of every assumption she'd made about wealthy men and their intentions. The weight of her deception felt crushing now, every lie a barrier between her and this unexpected connection they'd forged. "You're very kind," she managed to say, her voice barely steady. "More kind than I deserve." The words were truer than Alexander could possibly know, and Emma felt the gulf between her real self and her disguised self growing wider with each passing moment. She had come here expecting to dislike him, to endure his company for financial necessity. Instead, she was discovering someone who might have been perfect for her if she had been brave enough to meet him as herself. Alexander reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his, the gesture so tender and unexpected that Emma nearly gasped. Through her careful makeup and practiced mannerisms, through every ugly detail of her disguise, He was somehow seeing something worth reaching toward. "Emma," he said softly, "I know this might sound crazy, given that we've just met, but I feel like I've been waiting my whole life for a conversation like this, for someone like you." The restaurant's ambient lighting cast shadows across their table, creating an intimate bubble that seemed separate from the rest of the world. Emma found herself trapped between the overwhelming urge to confess everything and the terrifying knowledge that revealing her deception would end whatever was growing between them. How could she explain that she'd deliberately made herself ugly because she assumed he was the kind of man who would exploit her beauty? How could she admit that every assumption she'd made about his character had been wrong? "Alex," she began, his name feeling strange and wonderful on her lips, "there's something I need to tell you. Something about tonight, about why I—" But before she could find the courage to continue, Alexander reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that made Emma's world stop spinning entirely. The sight of it, elegant, expensive, unmistakably the kind of box that contained life-changing jewelry, sent every defensive instinct she possessed into overdrive. "Emma," Alexander said, his voice carrying a weight of emotion that seemed impossible given they'd known each other for only a few hours. "I know this is going to sound absolutely insane, and I know we've just met, but I can't let this evening end without taking a leap of faith." He opened the velvet box to reveal a ring that was breathtaking in its simple elegance, a perfect solitaire diamond that caught the restaurant's lights and threw them back in brilliant sparks of fire. Emma stared at it in complete shock, her mind struggling to process what was happening. "This isn't what you think," Alexander continued quickly, seeing the panic in her eyes. "I'm not proposing marriage to someone I met tonight. I'm not completely insane. But I am proposing something that might sound just as crazy." He paused, taking a deep breath as if gathering courage for what came next. "I'm proposing that we take a chance on each other, that we see where this connection might lead, that we give ourselves permission to believe that sometimes, when you least expect it, you can meet someone who changes everything." Emma felt as if she were drowning in the surreal nature of the moment. Here was a man, wealthy, successful, devastatingly attractive, offering her a ring after one evening together, but it wasn't just any evening, and they both knew it. The conversation they'd shared, the connection they'd forged, the way they'd seemed to understand each other despite being strangers, it had been extraordinary. And now he was asking her to acknowledge that extraordinary things sometimes happen between ordinary people. "The ring belonged to my grandmother," Alexander explained, his voice soft with memory. "She always told me to save it for someone special, someone who would understand its real value wasn't in the diamond, but in the promise it represented. The promise to be brave enough to love someone, to choose them every day, to build something beautiful together, even when the world tells you it's impossible." Emma's hands shook as she stared at the ring, her mind racing through 1,000 implications and possibilities. If she accepted it, she would be accepting it under false pretenses, built on a foundation of lies about who she was and what she looked like. But if she refused it, she would be walking away from something that felt more real and meaningful than anything she'd ever experienced. The cruelest irony was that she'd disguised herself to avoid exactly this kind of situation, only to find herself in it anyway, but with a man who seemed to see past every ugly detail to something worth treasuring. The weight of Alexander's offer hung between them like a bridge Emma wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. She looked at the ring sparkling in its velvet box, then at the man who was offering it with such vulnerable hope in his eyes, and felt her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Every assumption she'd made about wealthy men, Every protective barrier she'd built, every reason she'd had for her disguise seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the magnitude of what was being offered. "Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of unshed tears, "you don't understand. You don't know who I really am, what I really look like, why I'm really here." The words tumbled out in a rush of desperate honesty, each one feeling like a small betrayal of the connection they'd built. I'm not what you think I am. I'm not worthy of something so beautiful, so meaningful." Alexander's expression softened with something that looked remarkably like understanding. "Emma," he said gently, "do you think I'm blind? Do you think I can't see past ugly glasses and unflattering clothes to the woman underneath?" His words hit her like lightning, suggesting that perhaps her disguise hadn't been as effective as she'd believed. "I can see your natural beauty trying to shine through all those layers you've put on. But more importantly, I can see your soul, your heart, the person you are when you think no one is watching." The restaurant around them seemed to fade away, leaving only this moment, this choice, this crossroads between fear and faith. Emma realized that Alexander wasn't just offering her a ring. He was offering her the chance to be seen, truly seen, for who she was beneath all her protective layers. But accepting that offer would require a courage she wasn't sure she possessed, the courage to remove her disguise, not just physically, but emotionally, to stand before him as her true self and trust that he would still find her worthy. "I came here tonight expecting to meet someone shallow, someone who would judge me by my appearance and dismiss me as unworthy of their time," Emma confessed, the words feeling like both confession and absolution. "Instead, I found someone who sees value in things that matter, who treats people with kindness regardless of their station in life, who makes me believe that maybe fairy tales aren't just stories we tell children." She looked at the ring again, seeing not just its material beauty, but everything it represented: hope, faith, the possibility of love built on genuine connection rather than superficial attraction. "There's something I need to show you," Emma said, her voice steadying with newfound resolve. "Something I need you to see before you make any decisions about rings or promises or futures." With trembling fingers, she reached up and removed the thick, horn-rimmed glasses that had hidden her eyes throughout the evening. Alexander watched in fascination as she carefully wiped away the heavy makeup around her eyes, revealing the natural luminosity that no amount of cosmetics could truly conceal. Slowly, methodically, Emma began dismantling the disguise she'd spent hours constructing. She pulled the pins from her hair, letting her auburn waves cascade past her shoulders in a waterfall of silk and copper highlights. She wiped away the harsh, unflattering makeup to reveal the porcelain skin that seemed to glow from within. With each transformation, Alexander's expression grew more amazed, not because she was becoming more beautiful, but because he was seeing the courage it took to reveal herself so completely. "This is who I really am," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made myself ugly tonight because I was afraid of what a wealthy man might want from a poor, beautiful woman. I thought if I could just be invisible, unremarkable, I could protect myself from being used, from being discarded when someone grew tired of me." The confession felt like stepping off a cliff, trusting that someone would catch her before she hit the ground. Alexander stared at her transformation in wonder, but not the kind of wonder she'd expected. His eyes held no surprise at her beauty. As he'd suggested, he'd seen through her disguise from the beginning. Instead, his expression held admiration for her vulnerability, respect for her honesty, and something deeper that looked remarkably like love. "Emma," he breathed, "you are absolutely breathtaking, but you were breathtaking before you removed a single thing. Do you understand that? I was so wrong about everything," Emma continued, tears flowing freely now down her newly revealed cheeks. I assumed you would be shallow, predatory, interested only in what I could give you. Instead, you've shown me kindness I didn't know existed, genuine interest in who I am as a person, and now this incredible gesture that I don't know how to deserve." She looked at the ring still sitting open in its box, a symbol of faith and hope that seemed almost too precious to touch. Block 10. The choice. The silence that followed Emma's revelation was filled with possibilities, with the weight of choices that would determine the course of two lives. Alexander closed the ring box gently and set it aside, then reached across the table to take both of Emma's hands in his. His touch was warm, steady, grounding her in the reality of this impossible moment. "Emma," he said, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that comes from deep conviction, "I need you to understand something. The woman I fell for tonight, the one I want to give my grandmother's ring to, she isn't defined by how she looks with or without makeup. She's defined by her intelligence, her compassion, her strength in the face of adversity, her willingness to work multiple jobs to help her mother, her dreams of writing a novel even when life seems determined to crush those dreams." He paused, searching her eyes as if making sure she truly understood what he was saying. "You thought you were protecting yourself by hiding your beauty, but what you were really doing was testing my character, and I like to think I passed that test. I saw past your disguise not because I'm particularly perceptive, but because real beauty, the kind that matters, can't be hidden by glasses or makeup or unflattering clothes." Emma felt something shifting inside her chest, a loosening of fears and assumptions she'd carried for so long they'd become part of her identity. "But Alex," she whispered, "I'm still poor. I still have debt and problems and a mother who needs expensive medical treatment. I can't offer you anything close to what you could have with someone from your world." Alexander's smile was gentle but firm. "Emma, I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. What I don't have, what I've been searching for without even realizing it, is someone who can see me as more than my bank account, someone who values character over wealth, someone who can have a conversation that makes me forget about stock prices and board meetings and all the empty pursuits that fill most of my days." He picked up the ring box again, holding it between them like a bridge between two worlds. "I'm not asking you to marry me tonight," he said with a laugh that held both nervousness and hope. "I'm asking you to wear this ring as a promise that we'll take time to really know each other, that we'll build something real together, that we'll face whatever challenges come with honesty and faith in what we're creating." The offer hung between them, beautiful and terrifying in its simplicity. Block 11, the new beginning. 3 months later, Emma stood in the same bathroom mirror where her story had begun. But everything had changed. Gone were the thick glasses and harsh makeup, replaced by her natural radiance, enhanced only by the simple elegance that came from being truly happy. The engagement ring on her finger caught the morning light, its diamond sparkling with the same fire that had captivated her that first night at Celestine. But more than the ring's beauty, it was what it represented that took her breath away. The promise of a love built on truth, acceptance, and the courage to be vulnerable with another person. The financial pressures that had driven her to that desperate blind date were now distant memories. Alexander had insisted on paying for her mother's treatments, not as charity, but as an investment in their future family. Emma's mother was in remission, stronger and healthier than she'd been in years, and had taken to joking that her daughter's ugly date had turned out to be the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to their family. Emma had quit her part-time job at the bookstore to focus on her writing, a dream that had seemed impossible just months before. Alexander had converted a sun-filled room in his penthouse into a writer's studio, complete with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a vintage typewriter he'd found at an estate sale. Her first novel was nearly finished, a story about a woman who discovered that sometimes the most beautiful thing you can do is reveal your true self to someone brave enough to love you for it. The woman in the mirror looked back at Emma with eyes that sparkled with joy rather than fear, with confidence rather than desperation. She had learned that true love wasn't about being perfect enough to deserve someone's attention. It was about being authentic enough to attract the right person's heart. Alexander had seen through her disguise, not because he was particularly gifted, but because he was looking for substance rather than surface, connection rather than perfection. Their wedding was planned for the following spring, a small ceremony focused on the people who mattered most rather than the kind of society spectacle that Alexander's wealth could have afforded. They had both learned that the most precious things in life, love, trust, genuine connection, couldn't be bought or sold, only discovered by people brave enough to remove their masks and risk being truly seen. As Emma prepared to leave for her writing session, she touched the ring that had started it all, remembering the terrified woman who had walked into Celestine that night, expecting to endure a few hours of polite conversation. Instead, she had found her soulmate, her partner, her proof that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the courage to be ugly, vulnerable, and completely real. The fairy tale had been there all along. She had just needed to be brave enough to let someone else see it too.